Hello and welcome once more to Conscious TV. I'm Iain McNay and my guest today is Stephen Snyder. Hello Stephen.
Hello Iain.
And Stephen has co-written a book called Practicing the Jhanas, which is quite a slim book and it's a quite evolved book in many ways, but it is fascinating how you can progress through practice and end up in a quite amazing state. So we're going to look at Stephen's life and find out more about him on a human level and also find out more about his work and his wisdom. So the first thing that I wanted to ask you was about your childhood, because you were very connected with nature, weren't you? That was very important to you, and that kind of produced, in a way, your start to meditation, the world of meditation.
It did. I grew up on an island near Hawaii, so spent a lot of time in the jungle hiking and seeing nature in its fullness there.
And there was a way that you found a way into yourself, I think, wasn't there too? Because that was the catalyst, eventually the catalyst, because you found a peace in nature and you wanted to find that peace not just in nature. And that was your gateway, I think, to meditation, beginning of meditation. Because you meditated for 42 years.
I have.
Which is a long time.
I have. Yes, it's true. In nature, both the sort of sense of wonder and also the connectedness is really what I was in touch with. And I just really wanted to find a way that I could feel that same connection without having to go to nature.
Yeah, I think you talked about, when you explained it to me, like a groundedness, a coming home.
Right.
That's what we all want, really, isn't it? To find coming home. And there's so many ways to come home, and in a way, you're very lucky you found it through nature at an early age, because it gave you a clue, didn't it?
It did. It was very lovely to have it, to learn that way, and also know internally what I was looking for.
Yes. So, what form did this take? How did you what meditation did you start with?
Well, I started with Zen meditation, and that grew out of visiting Japan, Tokyo, when I was about 3 in 1960, and seeing Zen monks running around Tokyo, and feeling a sense of identity in seeing them, like a recognition in seeing them. And that when I was 19, then I gravitated to the Zen practices and a few books in those days.
So at 3 years old, somehow you could recognize there was something special about the monks?
Yes, my sense at that age was, there I am.
So that meant, what did that mean, there I am? For you
somehow
then?
There was a recognition somehow in seeing them and just seeing the shaved heads and the black robes. There was a way I just felt like I knew what that was.
Mm. Well, that's a great start, isn't it? Yeah. And then when you were, I think around 19, you read this book, The 3 Pillars of Zen,
right,
which was a catalyst in kind of giving you more of a clue to a form of meditation, I guess.
It was. I began with mindfulness of breathing, which is counting the breaths, and I was counting them in the area between the nostrils and the upper lip, which is actually what we teach now. So I did that for several years to get stability in meditation.
So that is basically when you say you're counting your breaths.
Correct.
So just talk more about that.
Sure. In those days, the way it was done was each inhalation and exhalation was counted. So inhale 1, exhale 2, and then you would count to some predetermined number like 10, and then back down again.
Right.
And you could see pretty quickly if you went off the breath, because you'd be either at 4 or you'd be stuck at 4 or you'd be at 32. So that told you when you weren't present.
Yes.
Or told me when I wasn't present.
Yeah. And what did you feel you got from meditation then?
Well, really the first time I sat down on Zafu to meditate, and I think I could meditate 5 minutes, that was the maximum I could do at those days. But I just felt like there was a coming home, a grounding in a way I didn't have in my life. And I felt like I got it immediately. And I knew I'd be doing this for the rest of my life.
Right. Well, that's...
And apparently that's true.
Yes, yeah. And then I know from what you told me, we had dinner the other night, that You had quite an opening when you were 28 years old. So I guess you've been meditating then for about 9 years.
Correct.
And so tell us, just talk us through what happened.
Sure. I'd been meditating and was reading the books of the day. There was a Zen text, a pretty well-known Zen text on the Chinese sixth patriarch of Chan, which became Zen. And in reading the book, it talked about how he was illiterate, but passing someone who was chanting a sutra, a talk by the Buddha called the Diamond Sutra. And there was a line in the sutra that he heard that said, "Produce the thought that is nowhere supported." And that landed in me. It sort of wedged in me in a way that I couldn't pick it up and I couldn't put it down. And so that began sort of meditative journey over a period of about a month of tracking what produces a thought. And I started with the senses, the touch, taste, smell, sound, etc., and went to each, its origin, sort of, let's say, the beginning of each sense. And when I got the last one there, it sort of exploded into this sense of that I'm not who I believed I was. I'm not the personality, and really I'm not anything. And so that was really a very liberative experience for me. And it was immediately followed with a oneness experience of I'm nothing and everything else is nothing and it's all one. So it really culminated in a way that was very profound to me at that age, and still in some ways I feel a little bit touched even speaking about it.
And I think you also told me that even though you had teachers at that time, they hadn't really had this experience themselves, so they could maybe talk to you about it, but not from a personal experience of that. So it was left you a little bit kind of on your own with it.
There probably were teachers that had experiences like this. I didn't have access to them. There were so few teachers in that day. And many of them were people who had gone to say, Japan for a year and lived in a monastery, then came back to teach, and they may or may not have had an awakening experience. So they could speak about it conceptually, and they had maybe had touches, but not in a way that, for me, it was profoundly life-altering.
Well, absolutely, yeah. So when you say you look to the origin of thought, what did you find about the origin of thought? Because that's a fascinating thing, isn't it? We're all thinking most of the time when we sit and meditate. I know when I sit and meditate, it takes me a time, but I can get to a place where at least I'm not completely absorbed in the thinking. I might think I'm not thinking, but if I think I'm not thinking, then I'm thinking I'm not thinking. It doesn't really count. So what did you discover about that?
Well, at that age, I began realizing that a lot of my thought came from sensory input. And so that's when I began exploring like sight, hearing, touch, all these different senses to find their origin, to go back to probably the consciousness for each sense organ. And when I got and there was a way I sort of put a post-it when I got to each one. If I followed, for example, sight and got to the sight consciousness, I had a little sort of mental or meditative post-it I put there. And when I got the last one there, that's when everything exploded.
Yes.
Because I realized that there was nothing that was actually producing a thought.
And I know we're jumping forward to now, we'll go back and cover some past ground in a minute, but is that still with you, that space where you have no thought, or you feel you have no thought sometimes?
Certainly, there's times when I have no thought. It depends how engaged I am in the world, like everyone. If I'm on the computer and talking to people a lot, then that's going to be more active. And if I'm in more silence, more... and also, for me, it works being out in nature more. Again, if I'm in a more remote area, that seems to really support the stillness, the silence, and not needing to turn to thoughts and speech as quickly.
And you see, the thing that I touched on just now, the dilemma is that if you're thinking you have no thought, of course, that's a thinking process. So it's almost like the no thought is discovered after time, when you realize thought comes back.
Right.
And then you realize there has been no thought for a time because there was no activity.
But there is an energetic impulse prior to thought, and we can get to where that will direct our actions. Like I'll know I need a sip of water, I won't have to form the words, there'll be an energetic impulse of thirsty water. And so that's how the functioning can happen without thoughts.
But where's that coming from?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I think that's part of the mystery for me.
Yeah, so it's almost as if the body in itself can look after itself to some extent, and it knows it wants to drink, so it just goes there without you consciously thinking, because the messages, the chemicals are getting to the brain saying it wants water.
And there is a famous Zen story about someone being told to develop non-thinking, and they ask the teacher, well, how do I do that? And the Zen master says, think non-thinking.
Is that a joke? Or?
No, it's an actual Zen story.
You think but how can you think not thinking?
Thinking non-thinking, you start with the thinking of it, conceptualizing, and at some point that will get exhausted. Okay. And then perhaps one can put it down even momentarily and see that there is a stillness and silence that's always here in our consciousness. And we can turn to thinking like a computer.
Right. Okay, so I'm looking at my notes, and it took you many years to discover the jhanas. Why don't you explain? I don't want to go into a lot of the detail in the book, because you really have to, I think, have sat and done some practice, and not everyone watching this would have necessarily done that practice. Correct. But can you explain, maybe for the beginner or relative beginner, how the practice of the jhanas works?
Sure. The jhanas is a concentration practice, and it's within a body of work in Buddhism we call purification of mind. And so we're taking the breath between the nostrils and the upper lip as our sole object of meditation, to the exclusion of everything else. And so that begins the journey, and that starts what we call momentary concentration, which just means you're with the breath moment by moment. And it develops, gets more concentrated in what we call access concentration. And that's a deeper concentration, and it has some beneficial goodies. We get feelings of joy and bliss and concentration there. And if that continues, we stay with the breath, that can lead to the non-dual state of jhana. Okay,
so it's a question of sitting with your eyes closed or your eyes open?
Eyes closed.
Eyes closed.
It's an interiorization practice. So we're turning away from the senses and sensory stimulus.
Right. So you're focusing on this area here.
Correct.
You're not necessarily focusing on the nostrils.
Correct.
Or the flesh here. You're focusing on the gap in between, not the gap, but the space in between, so to speak.
Really the breath.
The breath.
The breath. Okay. We're knowing the breath as it passes that area.
So you watch the breath as it comes in.
Mm-hmm. I tend to suggest to people that they be with the breath.
Right.
Like, for example, we're being together here. We don't need to do anything to be together. And the same way with the breath, we can be with the breath without a doing happening.
Okay. Well, maybe we can do something afterwards, the end of the program. You can just talk people through briefly the beginning of that practice, so
Sure.
they can, if they want to, they can get a practical feel for that.
Be glad to.
So, you studied law. You're a lawyer, aren't you?
I am.
Yeah. So how does that fit together, being a lawyer and being a Buddhist practitioner and I know you run seminars in different countries teaching the jhana meditation. So how does that fit together?
Well, I first was drawn to the law because I could see that the Buddhist organizations in the States, in terms of organizing, they were sort of flopping around a bit about how to organize and what works the best. And so I really felt a calling to the law initially so I could be of service to the Buddhist community in helping set up the corporate structures and the running of the Buddhist centers. So that was my motivation going to law school. But as a lawyer and a practitioner, when I was younger, I thought I had to keep these very separate. That if I combined them, I would be too soft as a lawyer. It just wouldn't work. But actually I found the opposite. As time went on, I couldn't keep them apart. They began to just intermerge, and I found my lawyering did better. People related to me better. I was more successful in my work. So bringing all of me to it made a difference.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, because I know over the years I've spoken to so many people that say, well, they love meditating, it's very important to them, and then they go to their work environment and it kind of almost, they have to forget it, and it's completely different, and it's stressful, and they maybe have a boss, or they have their own business and pressure with that. But I know for myself, having meditated like you many, many years, that actually the opposite is true. And somehow I think, and I think probably you're the same, it's like the most important thing when you're in some kind of profession is the ability to listen. And what people want so much is, they must be you with your clients, they want to be truly listened to. If they're truly listened to, somehow there's a connection, and there's a feeling, well, that person really gets me, understands me, and will be there for me when I need legal advice or court case or whatever. Right. And I just think that more and more that it's almost like encouraging people not to think that their practice is different from their everyday life, because it's not.
No, it's an artificial separation. I think the other thing along with the listening is the ability to be present. Because from meditating, we're meditating in the present moment. Like right now, we're very oriented to this moment. We're not anywhere else. So it assists our connection and our communication by each of us being present with the other, and to ourselves, of course.
Yeah. And do you find you can maintain that presence most of the time?
I do. I don't consider it a maintaining, rather than I don't resist it. It's always present. But it's sort of me going into thinking and excessive personality workings that crowds out presence, crowds out that sense of contact.
Yeah. And when you lose it, does it come back fairly quickly?
As soon as I relax.
As soon as you relax, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this book, we talked about it earlier, about the jhanas, that was actually written after you did a 2-month retreat with, see if I can pronounce it right, the Venerable Pak Sayadaw, is that right?
Sayadaw, but yes,
Sayadaw, yeah. So you found him after, I think you'd been meditating already, was it 20 years?
Probably more than 30 at that point.
More than 30 years.
Right.
And the notes that I had, which you gave me for the interview, it said after 30 years of meditation, you were still rough at the edges.
Right.
So what did that mean? How did you know you were rough at the edges?
Well, I had the good fortune or good karma to have access to some good teachers, and found that I had a lot of contact with the Transcendent, beginning at an early age in childhood. But I found that it was difficult to integrate and live from the realizations, the insights, the experiences. And so I was still acting in a sort of an awkward way, the way that most humans do. Even though there was this beautiful and great depth available, I didn't know how to function from it very well. And so that led me to exploring different options, and I ended up going to the Diamond approach, Diamond Heart.
Yes. So when you say the transcendent, you mean the absolute reality, sort of, they talk about an Advaita, where we're all one, we're all connected, and that's reality, which can often discourage us from exploring the world of human, which is complex, to say the least, at times.
Right, and I think in Buddhism we have a theory that if one has a, let's say, large enough realization, that it will in some serendipitous way blow out the personality to where, at least the awkward aspects of the personality, the undigested material, will get blown out. And in my personal experience and my observation of the teachers I've been around, I've never met anyone where I felt like that happened. So I knew that was a nice idea, but probably wasn't a reality. And I also witnessed, being an attorney for a number of Zen masters and groups, I saw a lot of the bad behavior that was going on in terms of their basically acting out of their dysfunction around them, their families and students, and the problems that that caused. So I could see that even following the Zen path, continuing, it wasn't going to help me integrate and live from it in a way that didn't cause more harm.
Yeah, it's almost as if the teachings, the Buddhist teaching, it's obviously an ancient teaching, and it came from a world that was very different from our world now. Our world, especially our Western world, is so complex in so many different ways, and life, I presume, all those thousands of years ago was much simpler,
right,
and so much more traditional, and so it was easy, much more easy to integrate, I suppose, your realization of the absolute reality with your day-to-day life,
right.
and now there's so many things you have to look at in the day-to-day life.
We've seen some studies that show that today the modern person has about 35,000 thoughts a day, and most of those thoughts, like 90%, are the same thoughts we had the day before and the day before. And when they measure the thoughts of some of these indigenous groups that are tucked away from civilization, they have between 800 and 900 thoughts a day. So wow. that goes to your point that probably that's what we need to function on, but we use these repetitive thoughts again and again each day that really may not get us anywhere.
Well, I haven't heard that before. That's fascinating. So what you're saying is people that live simply, I suppose it's obvious in a way, just think a lot less than people that live a busy, complex life.
Right. With all the electronics we have today and
yeah.
the fast pace, we're constantly connecting into that and being disturbed by it.
Yeah. So you mentioned Diamond Heart, which I've also been in for many years, which is it's actually proved to me to be so helpful in so many ways, because as you say, it does look at the psychological and the personal as well as focusing on the absolute. It's like nothing is excluded. So there are many teachings and traditions that just look at the absolute reality and ignore all the levels below, which we need to somehow find a way to balance, because we're living as human beings in, as I was saying, quite a complex world. So,
can I make one point on that? Is that also, like in the Buddhist world, it was viewed that people would move into being monastics.
Yes.
So they wouldn't have to function with spouses and children and mortgages and cars and all the rest.
Yes.
So and this world is mostly lay people now. So how do we live from that is really the big question.
Yes. So you felt that with the teaching that you'd been taught, it only partially helped people in terms of their journey.
Right. And so we began exploring, my teaching partner, Tina Rasmussen, and I began
yes.
exploring, introducing more of the psychological to what we were seeing students work with, and helping them understand their, let's say, personality patterning more, so they could unhook, they could become more neutral about the compulsiveness of that, the personality patterning, the thinking patterning, what we call in Buddhism the hindrances and the defilements.
Yes. And how do you do that on a practical level? So you're working with them in a workshop or one-to-one basis. So how does that come up as in a practical way?
Well, let's say on retreat, we just finished a 2-week retreat in Italy a few days ago, and as one is being with the breath to the exclusion of all else, what you're going to experience is a lot of the mind patterning, the things that compulsively get your attention, good, bad, or indifferent. And so by turning to the breath again and again, we develop more neutrality towards the patterning and the compulsion. And that helps people in their lives by, in effect, purifying the mind.
Okay. So, but let's look at it more like sort of the nitty-gritty of, let's say someone has financial problems. They've overstretched they've spent more than they earn, they're in debt. That's put pressure on their marriage. Their children want the latest devices, but they can't afford to buy them. Now, these are real problems that many people have.
Right.
How do you solve that in terms of meditation?
Well, the meditation is going to at least bring more serenity and tranquility to the person's consciousness. And by bring, I don't mean it's coming from anywhere. It's coming from their consciousness. So we can start by relaxing them a bit, and possibly there'll be an opportunity to see into, through discussion with them, to see what the drivers are, what's driving their need to spend so much, to please the family so much. And if that's understood more, then there become options. It's kind of like we're going down a certain road in our lives, and by slowing down with meditation, we can see some of the cross streets that we normally can't see when we're just moving forward in this busy life we lead.
Yeah, the problem is as well that that's almost the consensus thinking of Western society is to spend more and more and want more and more to try and find the elusive happiness which is looked for outside, when you and I know that the key is somehow inside.
It is indeed.
And that's it's not easy for people to see at times.
No. Well, that's part of the beauty of the Absolute, is that it gives us situations where we encounter suffering. And the suffering is really our catalyst to say, what can I do about this? And that's where some of us are drawn to spiritual practice, to search for answers.
Okay, so what you're saying is the Absolute, the kind of, that's almost top of the tree, if you like, in terms of the spiritual journey, that is actually giving us, you think there's something there in the Absolute that is giving us suffering, or things that could make us suffer?
Well, the Absolute is manifesting all form. So everything that we experience comes from the Absolute. And of course, it's our psychology and our upbringing and various things that cause friction when we come in contact with it. So I view it that it's part of the intelligence of the Absolute, creating these situations. And we have free will, but we create these situations that put us up against the places that were not digested, less refined, and that creates the frictions that can lead us to a spiritual journey.
Yeah, and it is often, I think, for most people that they start the spiritual journey because things don't work and they haven't got solutions.
Right.
And so we need some suffering to propel us on the path.
Correct.
Yeah. One of the things you talk about in the book is purification of the mind. So how do you see that exactly?
Well, purification of mind, we see it as having two aspects. One would be transformative, which would be more the maturing of the personality to be in alignment with one's level of realization. And the other is transcendent, which is the orienting toward the mystery. And that's what we do when we turn to the breath, because of course we can trace the breath from this body up to the Absolute. So both orienting to the mystery and also trying to live whatever our level of interior experience or realization is, that becomes purification of mind.
Okay, it sounds simple when you talk about it, but purifying the mind it's a lifelong process, isn't it, really?
It is. And that's what's important to realize, is that no matter how much we dedicate ourselves to spiritual practice, we'll never fully penetrate the Absolute, the mystery. There's parts that are always going to remain mysterious. And in some ways, for someone like me, that's really good news, because then I'm not rushing to find a finish line. I understand that process is what's important, not completion.
Process, not completion. So what do you do with your human drive, which I think a lot of us have, to complete something? Is it like it's always creating something else because it wants to complete, or can it get to a point where it rests?
I feel at this point in my life it's resting. For many years this was a driver for me, and of course I got validation and recognition in my life from teachers and parents from succeeding. So that was my orientation, and I was oriented as what we call a striver in Buddhism. I was trying to reach the goals, I was trying to attain, and that can work for a certain amount of momentum, but ultimately we have to surrender and we have to open ourselves to grace in order for the mystery to reveal itself in our consciousness.
So we were talking just now about Diamond Heart process and this working on the personality and not just relying on trying to find the absolute transcendent reality, but realizing we're human beings with our human programming, and that's all part of the parcel, if you like. And I know there's people, I feel anyway, who are kind of, they get too stuck in this examining the human side of things, and it's almost like it's a challenge of finding a balance of the transcendent, which is who we really are,
right,
and clearing debris away, trying, as you were saying, to purify the mind, and that process of trying to find the purification of the mind can be an endless process.
I think it is an endless process. And again, that's why it's helpful to me that there is no goal, there's no finish line. Because whatever, if we do purify, let's say from the outside in, the more dysfunctional aspects of our behavior, then we get more and more refined, but we're always going to be finding these little places and little memories or experiences that need some exploration, investigation, or inquiry.
But how is that for you in your own process? How do these things come up automatically, or are you still looking? Does something happen and then you get a reaction about something? Do you then look at what might be the origin of the reason for that reaction?
Sure. Of course, I watch for reactivity around interacting with other people, most particularly. But I find for myself that what I'm ready to work with comes up naturally in my process, either meditation or inquiry. It arises spontaneously. So that makes it a little bit easier. I don't need to go looking. But if I do find something that I feel like I didn't handle well, that will be something I'll want to explore more.
Right. You also talked about, in some notes I had from another interview you did, that there needs to be a willingness to be transformed.
Right.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because in a way, as we discussed earlier, we're trying to get away from this ambition, this doing, this wanting to achieve, and yet there still needs to be some impulse here, whether, I don't know what level it comes from, whether it's more the ego level or deep down, this willingness to change.
Right. That's quite important, because most of us when we start this journey, we want the transcendent and we don't actually want to change. But as it starts landing, we can realize that we're not functioning from it as fully as we experience it. And that's where it ends up being a rub that seems motivating to try to figure out how to address the various ways we behave that we feel are not congruent with our inner understanding.
Yeah, but is that always easy to spot?
No, I think it's not. And initially, because we're so identified with the behavior, we see it as subjective. So this is how I am. This is my behavior. This is what I do. But as we start exploring more and more, there gets to be a little bit of a space, a room in there where we can start seeing, okay, this is how I behave. This isn't necessarily who I am. And then it becomes objective. And when it's objective, we can work with it. When it's subjective, it's very hard to work with.
Yeah, but there's something that I don't have clear for myself is we're all human beings, as well as translucent beings. Both are still true, and this thing of a human being, and I'm always drawn to the real characters.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that character might contain a degree of excess. I don't always personally mind about that, because I find those characters like that, I find them stimulating. I find them they're the people that are going to discover something new, whether it be something in life, practical, or whether it be another way to look at the spiritual journey, another, if you like, another path up the mountain. They're the people that kind of are going to go outside the norm. They're the people that are going to somehow the way I see it is they're somehow, maybe through a route that isn't completely clear, they're the ones that, in one way, in touch with the absolute, because they're pulling something in that isn't the normal. It isn't the norm.
Right. Well, I think also what speaks to your point to me is that we all have a profound uniqueness to us. There's no one who's ever been made in the world quite like you, nor will there ever be. So there's something that's beautiful about that to me, and also then we don't need to become homogenized robots, the clones of the world. We can be very individualistic expressions, but we can also express ourselves in ways that aren't dysfunctional, that aren't harming ourselves or others. So I think to be open to the creativity, as you're talking about, and the uniqueness is very important. And I think it's necessary for us to maintain that. Otherwise, like in all traditions, Buddhist traditions, there are ways people behave uniformly. If you go to centers, you'll see people walking similarly and behaving similarly because they're modeling themselves after the teacher. But you see the most senior students, and they're not doing that. They're very much their own person and their own expression of whatever level of realization and whatever level of purification of mind they've established or worked with.
Yeah, but aren't the people that are doing the walking in a certain way and behaving in a certain way, isn't that the rules of the monastery or the rules of the center? Aren't they being told to do that?
Sometimes there are specific ways that we do formal walking, for example, in meditation. But I'm meaning more as people talk and walk. I heard a story once about the lead teacher at Diamond Heart, Hamid Ali, that at one point he was favoring using a toothpick during his sessions with students. And apparently, shortly thereafter, most of the teachers began using toothpicks when they worked with students. And of course, this was what Hamid was doing for himself. It wasn't something he was emulating or suggesting they do. But because people want to mirror their teacher in some way, they thought, well, maybe this makes a difference.
Okay, well, that's a specific example. I don't want to particularly go into that. But it does seem that, and in a way, I suppose I'm challenging you in your teaching, which is maybe a good thing to look at. That how can you be a teacher, and you know that there's a kind of a certain structure which is beneficial to the student, and if they're not somehow following that structure, at least to some extent, they're not going to understand or experientially get the value of the teaching. But how can you combine that with someone not giving their power away, which happens so much in spiritual communities, or losing, as we've just discussed, their unique, essential individuality?
Well, it's a big question, and I think that initially people will try to model themselves after the teachers. For Tina and I, we discourage that. We really encourage people to be themselves, to follow their own heart in their practice. And that seems to help. And also as a teacher, it's very important to recognize that it's a function, it's a role, it's not an identity. And if you take it on as an identity, that's when a lot of the problems begin, because you want to get that reinforced by the students, which puts them into a certain behavior with you, a certain relationship, which may not be very healthy. So it's encouraging them to be uniquely who they are, at the same time realizing that the Absolute is going to present for them whatever they need to work with and wherever they are on the path. So we don't need to manipulate that as teachers. We can just recognize where they are. And one last point on this is that you're quite right that there needs to be an established sense of self. We need a solid ego before we can move into transcending the ego. So some people need more ego development. They perhaps need therapy to clarify the ego in order to take on a deeper spiritual practice.
Yeah, that reminds me when I was quite involved with the Rajneesh movement several years ago, and I got a lot out of that. I really did, and I know there's a lot of controversy around it, and I don't want to comment on all that. But personally, from my involvement and doing the workshops and the meditations and listening to teachings, I got a lot. And then it was time to go. I was clear it was time to go. Not because I not because there was chaotic things happening. I quite like the chaos at the end, but it was time to go. And yet there's people now, and I still have friends who are still so involved, and they still kind of don't want to see, or let's just say they see it differently in terms of how things were and what went on, and that for them it's not a point where you need to move out,
right,
and find your own way again. And I know through my history, I won't go into all the details of that, it's kind of been, I've done that as totally as I can, I felt at the time anyway, got what I can, and then it's over somehow, not in a negative way, but it's like what's next?
Right.
And it's these, I've done this maybe 5 times with teachers now, moved on. And conscious TV is the basis of a teaching now, because we meet so many fascinating people. But I think that does tend to get lost, and I don't know why I'm saying this to you, you're a teacher, it's up to obviously you how you, but would you ever throw anybody out of your teaching if you felt they got to the end? Would you encourage someone to leave? That's a question.
Sometimes there are people who, as I mentioned before, might need more ego development before they take on the deeper practices. So that can happen. And sometimes there are people where we might feel that they might be suitable at that time to take on some other practice, or for example, engage in Diamond Heart or other specific meditation. So sometimes it feels as though someone is ready to move into something else for a while, and we don't know if we'll see them again or not. But speaking about it from the teacher's perspective, a teacher has to be willing to take on the idealization and the transferences of the student. That's part of the process. But you can't hold them as real. You have to hold them that they're projecting it because it's their process. They can't yet hold that they can have these experiences themselves, that they're worthy of having these experiences.
So talk more about this idealization that you mentioned.
Sure. Well, for example, with Tina and I, we were among the first Westerners to complete the Samatha program under our teacher. At that time, there were a couple of males, monastics had done it, Western male monastics, but virtually no one else. So in doing that, people project a lot that makes us special or unique or out of their league somehow. We have some special ability that they don't have. And so for a while that helps them to project that. But at some point we want them to integrate the practice as their own and realize their own authority about it, which is how we confirm the practice as people get to different landmarks of the practice, the progression. We'll confirm the landmarks and say to them, this is your experience now. You don't need to believe us or our book. You know it's true for you. And that's how we in our minds, we're helping people become more autonomous and independent too.
Yes.
Because we don't want them dependent on us. That's not the goal.
Well, absolutely. But it does seem to happen sometimes. That
it does.
Dependency is encouraged.
It can be.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this book, it's really written based on a 2-month experience in a retreat, and for both you and Tina, your teaching partner, an awful lot happened. How much of that was to do you think, with your past experience in meditation? I know that Renata, my wife, is going to interview Tina next, so we'll hear more about her side. But she was obviously a long-term meditator and even did a year of silence, which is extraordinary in the West these days.
It is.
And you had done, I think, 20 years meditation.
It was about 30 actually when we did that retreat, right?
30, you said it earlier, 30 years, yeah. So how important was that preparation, do you think? Or do you think someone that's a relative novice could also have got the same results with a commitment?
Well, I'd say anyone can take up the practice. We certainly have students that do it as a home practice, and then of course we teach retreats. One needs a sustained retreat in order to do this practice to its depth, because we really need silence, which is sort of the rocket fuel for the journey. And that is, in a retreat container, we can hold that better. So I think that's important. For me, I think my experience meditating for 30 years had a lot to do with it. For example, I knew how to conduct myself on retreat. Also, at that point, I'd already had the awakening, so I didn't have a firm belief in the sense of self. So as the consciousness approaches the non-dual state, most people have a certain amount of existential angst. The personality gets it's not going into the non-dual state, and it begins to put on the brakes. And for Tina and I, we'd each had an awakening beforehand, so there wasn't the same resistance or the fear of the non-dual state.
Mm. Yeah, those awakenings that happen, it is often a grace of God, isn't it? You can do the work, if you like, you can do the practice, the meditation, but you can't force the awakening. It either happens or it doesn't happen.
Well, meditation is non-linear. So when we're meditating, we're not creating a result. We're really kind of tenderizing ourselves, softening, being more receptive, being less reactive, less resistant. And so some of it is simply that, and getting to a point that we can, from inside, we can let go, we can surrender, and that's where the opening can happen.
Let go and surrender. What does surrender mean to you?
It means offering everything. For me, it's part devotional, where I feel when I'm deep in this practice or other practices, surrender for me means letting go of everything. All the good experiences, all the difficult experiences, anything that's coming up in my consciousness, I'm just letting go, I'm offering up to the absolute, not in a dualistic way, but just I'm putting my hand in the river and just letting the water flow. I'm not trying to grab anything.
You're putting your hand in the water, letting it flow, and not trying to grab anything. But the mind always wants to grab.
It does.
So do you watch the grabbing in the mind?
If it's present, I will, and if it's not present, then of course I won't.
And who's watching the grabbing in the mind?
Of course, the awake awareness is watching.
The awake awareness, yeah. But is that the transcendent, or is there another stage in between?
I think it's an expression of the transcendent. It's the way that it's the universal consciousness. We can say it that way as well.
Okay. So one thing that you, when we had our dinner, you talked about the 51% rule.
Yes.
Which I had heard before, but you did say that you came up with that, so obviously the other person had taken it from you.
I'm not sure I'd be quite that bold, but I will say that Tina and I came up with that about 10 years ago in our teaching. Yeah. And really that was meant to communicate to people. For most of us, when we make contact with the transcendent, it's glimpses. It's the little moments, the little flashes of insight and understanding that we have. And the 51% rule just simply means that as we have these glimpses, they can accumulate, they can collect. And when it seems to be when we get to that 51%, when it's more than half, then that's when the next glimpse turns into a life-altering, a foundation-shifting experience, to where we don't believe the personality anymore, and we understand that we are our deepest nature, which really is a personalization of the absolute.
So, for people that are not necessarily know this terminology, so 51%. So what you're saying is the 51% is when someone has enough experiences of, let's say, oneness or absolute reality, that they then are able to pretty much integrate that or start to integrate that in their daily life, so they're not caught in the dramas, or if they're caught in the dramas, they get out of it quicker.
Right.
And they have a different value system in their life, shall we say? Am I summarizing that correctly?
Right. It's the start of the shift. That then there's the whole process of understanding what the realization has been and how to live from it, and the places that we're not successful in living from it, where we're basically clunky humans.
Yeah. So 51% doesn't mean to say you're enlightened. It means
no.
So what it means that you've got to the point where you know who you are. You know, right. You're not just a human being,
right?
Individual. but you know you've got work to do, and you trust that life is going to guide you with situations that come up, and then you look deeper in these situations. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's well said.
Okay. Looking at my notes.
Can I mention one more thing about Diamond Heart?
Yeah.
I think one of the big values for me was being able to work with the ego deficiency. Because in Buddhism, we don't really have a way to work with that at all. I mean, the Buddha, of course, was teaching 2,600 years ago, and depth psychology is probably 150 years old, so it wasn't available. But that was an important piece of work to do, was working with that when it came up. So rather than that operating and really being problematic in terms of integrating transcendent experience, when that gets resolved, and of course in the Diamond approach work, it has to do with the development and emergence of what's called the pearl, which is the personal essence, the personal uniqueness of us as a manifestation of the Absolute.
Yeah, we should explain that Diamond Heart is also known as the Ridwan school.
Correct.
It's the head is A.H. Almas, also known as Hamid Ali. He's written many books, probably about 20 books, and if anybody is interested, they can Google Diamond Heart or Ridwan School, and they can find it. And you can go to introductory evening maybe, and then you can commit to join a group, and
right.
It's something that you've got value from, and I've certainly got enormous value from.
Absolutely.
Over the years, because it's something about, I think we're going to do a separate program which will go on the end of this interview on the internet anyway with Tina and Renata, my wife, and
yes.
we're going to talk more about this practical thing. But it's the integration of these experiences that's so important, isn't it?
It
because
is.
And without the experiences, you're never going to really find out who you really are. You're never going to really understand that, because you're still going to get caught in your human separateness. But the realizations in themselves are only pointers.
Right.
They're only kind of they're gateways. And they come and go. And
they do. Well, and for Tina and I, this is really how we see the current state of affairs. That we're in this model now, where more of us are living as lay people in the world. We're in relationships, we have families. We're not retreating to monasteries and nunneries anymore,
yes.
At least not in the volume that once was true. So it really becomes, how do we live from our experience? How do we function as ordinary people who are actually quite extraordinary? And that's true for everyone. Everyone is extraordinary. But how do we learn to live from that and express our uniqueness in a way that connects us rather than divides us?
Yeah. Well, it's probably a good place to finish, I think.
It sounds good.
Okay.
Thank you so much for having me, Ian.
Well,
it was a pleasure.
Thank you, Stephen. I'll show the book again, Practicing the Jhanas, by Stephen and his working partner, Tina, which you can get on Amazon. And if you're on the internet and you want to know more, stay tuned. And thank you for watching Conscious TV. Goodbye. So hello and welcome back to Conscious TV, and this time we've got Renata and myself and Tina and Stephen, who we interviewed separately previously. So you're watching this and the back end of the previous interview. We're going to have a general discussion now. I should say first they've written this book about the jhanas, which is very interesting, which is Practicing the Jhanas, which is available, I'm just being told, not only in English, but in Korean and Italian. That's very impressive, isn't it? So,
and German.
And will be in German.
Spanish.
That's right. Yeah.
Spanish.
And Spanish. Fantastic. So welcome back, Tina and Stephen. And Renata's got a question to kick us off, I think.
I have a question, yes. So my question is that it seems, and we also experience to some extent, that people are waking up all over the place and have deep, profound experience of the nature of reality without ever having meditated. Now, why meditate? And how do those people can be motivated to meditate?
Mm-hmm.
You know, grace seems to happen, and maybe it has to do with our time. I don't know. Yeah. So how do you see why should we meditate?
Especially since we're non-dual Buddhist teachers who encourage meditation.
Exactly.
It's a good question.
Yeah, and you did a 1 year long solitary retreat, and you meditated 35 years, and I don't know how many years.
It's been since 1976, so it's a long time.
Yeah.
We actually started meditating the same
Well,
year.
he meditated 30 years, didn't you?
Oh no, longer than that.
40 years.
40 years at
Yeah.
least, yeah.
I meditate sometimes.
Well, one thing is that some people meditate just because they enjoy it, so that's good to say. But meditation, one can make an argument that all of this is manifesting from the ground, whether we meditate or not. Awakening happens, and it may not be linearly caused. Like, for example, we can't say that if you meditate you will wake up. We can't guarantee that. So meditation isn't a guarantee. That's the first thing, is to say that that is acknowledged pretty much everywhere. And yet at the same time, for people who feel that enlightenment drive for awakening, the odds tend to increase if one does meditate. So if one has already been awakened, there may be other reasons to meditate that we can also talk about, but if one hasn't awakened, meditation is a way of cutting through the veils of the personality to experience what we actually are, and can provide either glimpses or extended experiences of that can lead to awakening. And that's really what meditation has been for at a deeper level. There's also just meditating on a daily basis because it makes your life better. And all of the brain research that's out now, which we can talk about, really shows the health benefits.
I think too with meditation, it's a great process of, sometimes it's talked about as tilling the soil. It helps break up the ground so that if we do get these seeds that can grow into awakening or realization, they've got a place to land and be fertilized. And in addition, I think to me there's something about that when we meditate, we're orienting towards the source, towards the mystery, towards the absolute. And on some level, it feels as though we're offering ourselves in the meditation. So it's kind of a direct contact saying, I'm here and I'm opening to this experience of whatever the absolute wants to bring in.
So we set, and when we start meditating, it sounds like we set an intention.
Sort of an
And
unspoken
then
intention.
it takes its own movement, the intention.
Right.
Would you see it that way?
I would say it's a soft intention,
Yeah.
but it's also a recognition of that we are opening to the absolute coming into our lives in whatever way is the wisest.
We're also oriented to the present moment, and so it's a practice of being present, and also meditation allows us to see the patterns that keep that from happening. And so in some ways, a lot of people think that if they go into thinking while they're meditating that I'm not meditating or it doesn't work. But that actually, if we understand the purpose, that shows us the patterns that we're constantly driven by. So even for somebody who's already awakened, meditation can be a way of digesting and reclaiming or really integrating the personality material that keeps us from being in the present moment. So even after awakening, there are some benefits to meditation that may be different than before awakening.
I think absolutely that after awakening, meditation can help us integrate the experience. It can open it more and just make it more accessible. So there's a way that it really does help deepen the awakening and let it land more fully in our consciousness.
For example, with the Dzogchen practice, which is one of the main practices we do ourselves, there's what's called resting in Rigpa, so that one realizes Rigpa, so that's really realizing the primordial awareness that can happen in glimpses or can happen for extended periods. And then as a person tries to live more from this on a more ongoing basis, the practice actually helps us rest in Rigpa so that this becomes more consistent all the time. So that's where 2,500 years of millions of people experimenting with this and trying to stabilize realization, there's some benefit to what's been learned over this 2,500 years.
I heard the Dalai Lama once say, I don't know if I heard it or I read it, probably I read it, that there are some cave yogis who meditate like 25 years, and he said nothing will happen to them unless they follow pointers. They need to, like I experienced when I did some Mahamudra meditation, the teacher gives you a pointer and then you start seeing actually where you are in the moment. And then there is the next pointer, and he said, this is important, otherwise consciousness does not move. I don't know, is this your experience, or do you have anything to say to that? I found it fascinating that there are some cave yogis and they just sit there, and he said nothing comes out of that.
That's a good question. I'll answer it on a personal level. That I felt that when I was in the Zen tradition, I was like a hot air balloon pilot. I could get up into the air, but I never knew with the open awareness where I was going to go or where I was going to land. Where for meditation like this, the Jhana meditation, I feel more like I'm a pilot in a modern aircraft. I've got all the switches and dials, and I know how to adjust them and turn them on.
Yeah.
So it gives a lot of structure in a way that we really can keep going, as you say, in a certain direction. And again, we're still offering and opening ourselves to the mystery, to the absolute. But it gives us more of a kind of technique, and we can stand alone, and then it's less serendipitous.
Right, and having a teacher is really crucial. This is part of, when a lot of the people have come to us, some of them practiced and the teacher wasn't as accessible, or maybe they met with them once on a long retreat. And what we find when we do retreats, we meet every other day with people, and that makes it where they're not wasting a lot of time doing things that are unproductive. And without some guidance, that's easy to happen. So it's a shame that somebody would waste many years doing that, but this is part of the benefit of working with a teacher.
I think it would be useful just to highlight how the meditation you're doing is quite different from Vipassana meditation, because as I understand it, Vipassana meditation, you're not focusing on one object, you're more open, it's about awareness, it's about being present, and if attention goes somewhere, then you allow that to happen without engaging with it. So your attention might go to the body, and you're aware of that. It might go to a sound, it might go to all kinds of things. But with the jhana meditation, what you're doing is you're focusing on a single point, and the point, as you did in the meditation earlier, is the point here. And so whatever happens, you come back to here. Am I explaining that right?
Yeah. There's, within Theravadan Buddhism, there's 3 stages, sila, and then the 2 you described, samatha, which is what we're teaching, the anapanasati, the mindfulness of breathing. And then there's vipassana, which is an open awareness. So like in the brain research they're doing nowadays, there's 4 categories, and those are 2 of them. One is focused attention, one is open awareness. And they're each cultivating different things that are really important for our deepening and our unfoldment.
And you also talk about access concentration and absorption concentration. Do you want to explain the difference between those two?
Sure. As we get more concentrated, we all start with momentary concentration every meditation. As we get more concentrated, again, it's that light we talked about earlier. Tita talked about in her interview, that light that narrows some as our mind unifies. Then it gives us the opportunity to go a little bit deeper. And in access concentration, there's also some benefits that arise that we call Jhana Factors. And these are things like joy and bliss and one-pointedness, and this assists the meditation, so we go deeper still. So the process, all meditation has momentary concentration and access concentration. Only concentration meditation has absorption.
Right, so for example, in Vipassana is a great practice, so we're not saying anything negative about it, but because it's an open awareness and the contents of our awareness are changing, it caps out at the level of access concentration, whereas meditations that are focused attention, one can actually experience jhana. That's a possibility that isn't available with open awareness meditations.
I just wanted, just before you come in, Renata, I just wanted to also read a quote from your book here, which I thought was interesting. Or it might have been a quote from Stephen, I'm not sure. Increasing the depth of meditation serves to purify the mind more and more fully. It's like a rock polisher. As the polisher turns the rocks, tap this wrongly, as the polisher turns the rocks, come on contact with each other again and again, knocking the rough edges and debris off one another. So it's like, right, the more you do, the more smooth, I guess you're smoothing your character, your personality.
The pearl.
And you're saying it's the pearl, the pearl beyond price.
That's how a pearl starts to shine.
Yeah.
It's rubbing,
it's
rubbing in the shell with the sand, and that's what makes it shine.
Yeah.
Well, Iain, it's what we talked about in the interview about what drew me to work with the Diamond Heart work, was the fact that I had this level of contact with the Transcendent, but I could tell that I had these rough edges that were bumping people the wrong way, not the way I intended, not the way I felt internally. So that's where these kinds of programs, where things like the Jhana practice or things like Diamond Heart will help us develop into more whole, full people.
Okay.
So after so many years of meditation and being really masters and in meditation and teaching meditation, do you still have your daily practice, and do you feel you're still expanding through meditation, or is there still something happening?
Absolutely, yes. We both have daily practice and think that's very important, and really wouldn't do without it. It's kind of like brushing your teeth, it's in that category for us of something that you do every day because it's good for you. And so for us, that's very important. The expansion of the practice really for us at this point is about living from what realization we have, and how can that be embodied and lived from as much as possible. So this is really, for us, kind of the growing edge, you might say, of our practice, is really living from the realization that we've had just as a human.
And it's interesting, as you get more refined, as you let your experience land, it opens you up more so that there's more capacity to receive. So it does feel as though there's expansion as there's digestion and as we learn to live from it. So it's a self-reinforcing process.
Right, and there's also personality material that still needs to be digested and worked through and refined, that can be seen also with that clarity. Sometimes it's easier to see that patterning, that's where the stuck places are.
So I sometimes hear about research, and you kind of mentioned it in earlier. There's a lot of research done around meditation, and it gets more and more scientific and more and more understood, and there seems to be changes happening in the mind.
Yeah.
but does that actually, these changes also influence us how we live then?
Mm-hmm.
Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
What kind of changes are those?
Mm-hmm. Well, the brain research, some of it is just incredible. Like, one of the things that impressed me when I started reading it is that the actual gray matter of the brain changes, and that for meditators, and especially long-term meditators, a 50-year-old meditator's brain will look like a 25-year-old's brain. And so there's clearly benefits that
You get
are...
younger?
No, with any kind of meditation.
You become younger.
Your brain becomes younger.
Your brain becomes younger.
We haven't found a way to work on the hair or the wrinkles yet, so we'll let you
Is
know.
there not a meditation which makes the body younger too?
Now that would be a supernormal power, wouldn't it?
Yes, we're still looking for that one.
Well, what's interesting from the brain research, as Tina's saying, is that they're finding with long-term meditators we actually produce more gray matter. So it isn't
Right.
just that we're taking advantage of it more, we're actually growing new gray matter. So just thinking about that, it's just magnificent.
And it can happen at any age. Age is irrelevant. Whenever someone starts meditating, and they found through like some of the studies of MBSR and others that have been rigorously studied, that it doesn't take that much meditation to start producing health benefits, blood pressure, stress reduction, all kinds of, there's 250 studies or more a year now done on meditation. So it's extremely beneficial just from a practical standpoint. Just like physical exercise, this is exercise for our consciousness. And it's been so proven now through science that it's kind of irrefutable at this point.
Yeah. So
You had lots
then
of other questions.
the next question is, so I know we can have all kinds of realizations through meditation, or waking up, or I don't know if you can get enlightened just through meditation. So how do you see realization? What, we interviewed about 400 people, and it looks like there is such a variety in realizations and awakening, and there's no real scientific paper out yet what enlightenment is, where we can be measured on. You came up with the 51%
Right.
of that's something. Yeah.
Well,
so
what's important to realize is that within the absolute, all realizations are contained there. There's no distinction in the absolute between religion or spiritual practice, meditation or non-meditation, because all of it, the absolute contains all of it. So the understanding that all these realizations are available to each of us really just depends upon our consciousness and we might frame it as our karmic propensity, things like this. So, but there are lots of realizations. So to say that, someone has one, it may not be one that we have as part of the totality of Buddhism, but for Tina and I, it's not a matter of not recognizing that, because it's coming from the source, from the absolute, rather than from a tradition.
So a realization is a glimpse of who we are. Would you say that?
Well, this is where we get, for us, and we really discovered the 51% rule just in our conversations with each other. That was where it came from, even before we were teachers, when we met and talked about our own background and history of people can have glimpses, and for us, we don't consider that awakening. We consider that glimpses, because basically the person still feels like a me that's having glimpses. I mean, it's extremely beneficial, but it hasn't actually changed the person's perception of what they are. So this is where we came up with the 51% rule of people having enough glimpses. So maybe 20% of their conscious identifies as the ground, and then at some point some experience can happen, maybe a big one that takes them up to 60%, but anytime after the 51%, all of a sudden they experience themselves as being the ground of being, rather than as being the ego self. And at that point there's a shift that is irreversible, that keeps deepening the person keeps practicing. So for us, that's really how we define awakening, is when that shift of identity happens.
And really, after the 51%, one of the hallmarks is that the person doesn't say that I'm awake. What they realize is that awakeness happened in their consciousness. So it's not an ownership, right? And before then, it's I'm having these realizations. Mm-hmm. There's still an ownership of it. Mm-hmm. So that's part of the shift.
Also, not only in my experience, and probably in your experience, and you mentioned it in your book, it's a visceral experience, awakening. It's like something in the body woke up as well. It's not only a knowingness, it goes so much deeper than the knowingness.
Right. We could even say it happens on the cellular level, that the cells begin to wake up in our body in a way that you're talking about. Yeah. And it may be slow at first, but there is a way that it does sweep through the body, and it ends up activating all these little corners and nooks and crannies in us.
I think this is part of, sometimes there's the blissful sensation, and that to me feels very embodied, that just being a human, there's a lightness, there's a sense of buoyancy, and that's part of the embodiment of the awakening, is really feeling that the body doesn't have the same density as we might have perceived.
Mm-hmm. So you just mentioned human. What is a human? When is a human?
It's a great song by Rag and Bone Man.
What is a complete human? And what is enlightenment? You know, we have the enlightenment drive. How does it look like being? Is there anybody completely enlightened? Is it possible to live in this world being completely?
We've asked if we think there's anyone who's fully enlightened. We've talked about that a lot lately.
We should ask you. You've interviewed 400 spiritual teachers.
You would know better than anybody.
Well, 400 different answers.
We think we're all a work in progress, and that maybe there is a place that one doesn't need to work any longer, but it seems to us at this point there's, again, no end to the depths of the mystery, and there seems to be no end to the depths of the personal material that can come up and we need to work with too.
Yeah, and
the fullness, really, the way we often talk about it is the absolute functioning through the personal, through that uniqueness that we all are, which is really the beauty of the human experience, is that we're all unique and there'll never be anyone like any of us again in history, and there never has been everyone. So there's a unique way that ground that is manifesting everything can only know itself through the human experience. As far as we know, there aren't any other beings that can become enlightened. There might be some that can be self-aware, like dolphins and elephants and so on. But that is really the human experience, is the ground knowing itself, functioning in form. And so this is where the consciousness comes into the human form and loses contact with being the ground through the structuring of the self-reflective awareness. And the ego development is just a stage. It's just that it's not complete. So awakening, in our view, is the fullness of the human experience, where the ground is actually knowing itself, which is all of this and all other beings, as the ground, though, not as the ego self. So that's really, to us, that's really the journey, is the realizing what we really are, and then the working through of the personality material, not that it all has to be gone, but so that it doesn't obscure.
So working through also means disidentifying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, because when one is, again, this is part of the Dzogchen teachings, but one is abiding in the primordial awareness that's always here for every human. Every human has it. We don't have to do anything to get it. When there's the abiding there, the personality can be active even, but there isn't the identification with it. And that's really where the suffering can often happen, is when the identification is present. So that, to us, that's really the journey of, you asked what does it mean to be human and awakened. That is, we frame it as the transformational and the transcendent. So the transcendent is the part of our experience where we're in touch with our deeper nature. The transformational is the part where the ego self becomes more and more digested, and we're less functioning from the survival instinct, which the body needs to survive, and we're functioning more from the enlightenment drive.
That's something so important what you just said, Tina, because and I know you both emphasized it in your teaching and in the book, that the transformation is sometimes not so interesting. It's more interesting, but when we started with Conscious TV, there was still much more focus on it. That was 10 years ago. Much more focus on the transcendence. You know, there was, for example, Neo-Advaita. Nobody is here, nothing to do, kind of things.
Right.
And some people, you know, loved it and but also went through agony with it, because there was a lot here.
Right.
But that is changing. A lot more people talk now embodiment and being in the world.
Right.
And I know Iain interviewed the guy who is on Ramana Maharshi.
Michael James.
Michael James. You know, Ramana Maharshi's teaching, where it's all going in. That's the only thing. The world does not exist. It's all a dream.
Right.
And then you ask, what this incredible beauty is that just here to distract us from going in.
Right. Well, we can all see this is the shift in consciousness.
Yeah.
Because again, we're moving out of the monasteries and the nunneries into the world.
Yeah.
And how does it work? And this is really a place in history where it seems like we're really, you know, some of the music from the 60s, the age of Aquarius may be upon us, but we're at this point where we have to make the big shift up. And that's part of why, in our opinion, the pendulum is swinging in the other direction, and we see a lot of extremism and fundamentalism in the world, because it's really taking the pendulum back there before it makes that new sweep into a more unified and a more whole world for all of us to live in.
Yeah, we really feel that the transcendent, and this is where we started out, was on transcendent paths, and we had capacity there and were able to do those paths. And we both thought about becoming cave yogis and turning away from the world, but there was something for both of us in not doing that, and so we were headed that direction, and we turned back to the world, because it feels like now the time is to bring this consciousness into form so that all of materiality can be enlightened in a certain way. And so it's not enough to transcend. We want to actually be in the world as humans. I mean, the human experience has so much beauty and suffering, but it seems like in Buddhism, this is one of the things we don't agree with, that basically you're just born to realize the absolute and then get off the karmic wheel of rebirth as fast as you can. That doesn't make sense to us. The human experience is so much more than that, and so much more beautiful.
And why wouldn't the people who are being realized, why wouldn't they be reborn and coming back into the world and bringing that consciousness, contributing it to the collective so that everyone is enriched and every being is enriched?
Yeah.
This is part of the Bodhisattva vow, is
That's
that
right.
one will continue to have rebirth until all beings are enlightened. And, you know, that seems like a long-term project, you know, a long-term goal. But when one realizes the unity, you're not coming back for someone else. It's your own. As the ground, everything needs to be enlightened for that process to be complete.
And that's one thing with people having awakening experiences. One quality that can happen is they can really have the sense that the collective has awakened in this location. So the whole collective has that, the charge gets sent out in some way. And so everyone, we could say, is elevated by that one individual having that experience.
Yeah. That's compassion.
It is compassion, right?
Yeah. And love.
And love.
Yeah.
Well, that's quite a nice place to finish. Anything else, burning questions you had?
You two are so cute.
You are.
So thank you very much, Tina and Stephen, for joining us on Conscious TV. And if you've watched all 3 segments and you've watched also the separate interview, then you've done very well. So thank you for watching, and I hope we'll see you again soon. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Hello, my name is Tina Rasmussen,
And I'm Stephen Snyder.
and we are the authors of Practicing the Jhanas. And we're going to do a short guided meditation of the Anapanasati practice, which means mindfulness of breathing. And this is the practice we describe in our book that can lead to the jhanas. So I'll start with doing some posture instructions, and then Stephen will go through the actual mindfulness of breathing instructions. So sit comfortably with your eyes closed, really feeling yourself sitting and surrendering your weight to the seat, to the earth that's supporting us. Starting with your feet and really feeling your feet on the ground, and moving up to your sitting area, to the hips. And it really helps if the hips are slightly tilted, and so there's a natural S-curve to the spine, and if we can allow that to be present, it really supports the practice. And in this meditation, because it's a serenity and concentration practice, it really helps to have our posture set up when we start, so that we don't have to move around too much while we're meditating. Although if you need to move, it's fine. Helps to have the knees slightly lower than the hips to have that natural tilt. And then moving up to your lower back to see if it's possible to just allow that natural curve in the lower back and in the front of your body. Really let the stomach relax. Maybe take a deep breath into the belly. And then moving up to the chest. It's very easy to have our chest be collapsed in meditation, so we really want to see if we can allow the shoulders to be relaxed down the back and the chest open, and to allow the other side of that S-curve in the spine in the upper back. This really allows us to breathe fully and to be open-hearted as we meditate. And then going up to the neck to see if that's loose and without stress. Feeling how the neck joins the spine and really rests on top of the spine. Going down the arms to your hands, having your hands just placed comfortably on your legs or folded in your lap, whichever is more comfortable, but really having the arms be relaxed, not having to hold them up. And then coming to the head, really feeling the weight of the head resting on top of the spine so that we don't have to spend a lot of energy keeping our head in place. It's helpful to have the chin just slightly tucked, as if your face is on a plane that would be equal, facing a wall, so that your neck isn't sticking out, causing neck strain. And moving to the face, just let your face relax. Let your eyes relax. And even the scalp. And with the jaw, we hold a lot of tension there, allowing for a little space between the jaw and where it meets the skull. And this can be done by just lightly touching your tongue, the tip of your tongue, to the roof of your mouth behind the upper teeth. This naturally relaxes the jaw and allows for an energy circuit to be completed in the body. And if that is uncomfortable, you don't need to do that. And now just seeing if you're balanced from the left side to the right, making sure your weight is evenly distributed. And finally, just feeling the weight of your body resting on the chair gently, relaxed and yet alert.
The simplest meditation instruction we give is to breathe, to know you're breathing in the region between the nostrils and the upper lip. The traditional instructions for the meditation are to seat yourself in an upright posture, relax your body, let your shoulder blades melt down your back towards the floor. With eyes closed, allow your awareness to rest on the breath as it's moving between the nostrils and the upper lip. The object of this meditation is the breath. Again, you are to know the breath as it passes between the nostrils and the upper lip.
And if your awareness goes off of the breath, just return it with gentleness and kindness, without criticism or judgment. Just bring it back and rest in this region with the breath.